Alright, just to explain to you guys while the presentation loads what's going to happen here. Patrick and I had a debate, and that's what we formed our TOK presentation around this debate. Now, it does have a Prezi to go along with it. The visual aid was created after the debate just so that you guys could have something to follow along with, but to emphasize, the debate was not structured around the Prezi, but the Prezi was made to follow the debate. And we're about a third of the way loaded, so it might take a second. It's taking a while.
Oh, nope, now she did.
Okay, go.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our weekly debate. I'm Leroy Jenkins, your host, and today we'll be joined by our guests, Patrick Stouffer and Luciano Sanchez, to discuss the events which transpired at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. But first, I'd like to take a moment to summarize the tragic events which took place in Newtown, Connecticut. On the 14th of December in 2012, Adam Lanza, a 23-year-old man living with his mother, killed his mom and took her 3 guns, an assault rifle and 2 handguns. He then took these guns and proceeded to enter Sandy Hook Elementary, where he killed 20 children and 6 adults in the building. He then took his own life before he was able to be apprehended by police. Mr. Stouffer, what are your initial thoughts on the matter?
Well, I believe that the events that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary School raises some very important points. I think that we should have regulation on magazine size, and we should implement more background checks, and also I believe that we should restrict the types of guns that we can own as individuals.
Very interesting point. Mr. Sanchez, what are your thoughts? Well, Mr. Jenkins, I think that we should have our staff heavily armed and trained to deal with situations like this in order to protect our children. In fact, I would even go to the extent to say that we could use armed guards to protect our children at their schools. I see. Mr. Stouffer, can you elaborate a bit on the points you mentioned?
Yes, through the emotional response that was seen in the nation as a whole, I believe that a great way to correct these problems would be to regulate the capacity in a magazine, also to have more thorough background checks as well to prevent the guns from falling into criminals' hands, and also to restrict assault weapons and who can own.
Oh, I disagree. As Americans, we've had a very close relationship with guns since we came to be. Going back to colonial times, if not for guns, we would still be ruled by a tyrant king. Guns allowed us the opportunity to fight back against the British during a time where they had military superiority. Persons having individual rights to guns allowed us to fight against the king and to win our freedom. When creating the Constitution, our founding fathers also had the people's best interest at heart when creating the Second Amendment, which claims that all people have the right to bear arms. Interesting stance, Mr. Sanchez. You brought up the Second Amendment. Let's discuss the semantics of that. Mr. Stouffer, why don't you start us off?
Well, I believe that a well-regulated militia and the right of the people to keep and bear arms mean one and the same thing. I think that the people and the individuals create the militia, and it is not the individuals who have the right to keep and bear arms, but rather the militia, which is created by the individuals, has the right to keep and bear arms.
Oh, I disagree completely. I think that, obviously, separated by a comma, those are 2 completely separate clauses in the Second Amendment. The first clause, completely separated by a comma, states that we have the right to a well-regulated militia. Now, this is completely separate from the second clause in the Second Amendment, which states that the people have the right to keep and bear arms. This is our individual right, and this should not be infringed. I think this brings us to our debate's overarching question. To what extent is the Newtown, Connecticut school shooting justification for the regulation of magazine size, the implementation of background checks, and the restriction on assault weapon ownership? Or would this unreasonably violate our Second Amendment rights? Would you like to start us off, Mr. Sanchez? Yes, I would first like to start by saying there should be no gun-free zones. Gun-free zones are a violation of our Second Amendment rights. We should be able to carry guns wherever we want, however we want, and basically that would allow us to defend ourselves adequately wherever we are at any time. For example, the Sandy Hook school shooting was a perfect example of how gun-free zones turned out to be a negative. The perpetrator, Lanza, utilized the area as a perfect opportunity to shoot without being shot back at. He could walk in and he shot people and they had no defense. They simply hid and were murdered. Now, in a place in America where there would be no gun-free zones, perhaps the teachers, the staff would be armed and trained to deal with situations like this. So instead of running and hiding, they could shoot back and prevent more casualties. Now, this also brings me to my next point, which is that not only should there be people assigned to protect our children with deadly force if need be, but they should be trained to protect themselves as well. I think that by training them at an early age to use guns safely and effectively, they can learn to protect themselves against any type of threat that might come up. This would make us stronger as a people, as a country, from a very young age. For example, in Israel, at 18, everyone, man and woman, is required to do 2 years of service in the military. Now, afterwards, they're simply a type of reserve soldier, so if anything does come up, they're trained and able to deal with any situation. So, if there was a disturbance in a public area, any number of people around there, any type of any adult would be able to deal with the situation. Which brings me to my final point, the ability of people to deal with enemies. So the bigger the gun, the better. I don't think you should be limiting the types of guns that we can own as Americans, because that would simply put us at a disadvantage, because criminals will have larger guns. And if we can adequately defend ourselves against people with guns, then that means we're going to need to have military-grade weapons. We should have the right to have magazines with 30 round capacities. We should have any type of weapon that we deem necessary.
Well, Mr. Sanchez, I'm going to have to stop you right there. The claims that you're making are absolutely preposterous. I feel as if we were to have no gun-free zones, it would only create a more dangerous situation within America. We would definitely have our firearms being misused all over the place. This brings me to my first point, that we should limit magazine size. I feel as if we should start with magazine size at 10. So what am I saying? I feel we should have a 1-round maximum in our magazines. Not only would this help to protect our people, but this would also make anyone who is using their firearm far more thoughtful about how they're to use their ammunition. I also feel that we should have more thorough background checks. We should check people's mothers, check their mothers' mothers, check their kids to see for any instabilities, check their neighbors, why not? Just to see how their neighbors are, if their neighbors are dangerous, if their neighbors perhaps might even break into their home, steal their weapons. I think that we should prevent any firearms from falling into the wrong hands or into any criminals by having these thorough background checks. I also feel that we should have no guns in America. It should be a gun-free zone all over America. I think that none of our civilians should be allowed to have guns. More specifically, our schools should not be allowed to have guns. And I believe that these preposterous claims you make of how you describe it, infantry, should be completely thrown out. I think that if we were to have no guns in America, situations would be far more resolved, and they would have far better solutions than to shoot someone or to use our firearms for the wrong reasons. If we were to take away all the guns of the Americans, of the individuals, and perhaps leave firearms for just our law enforcement, we would definitely have them as well have these 1-round maximums, because that would also make them more thoughtful about how they were to use their ammunition. For example, in Australia, they had one mass murder in the 80s, and after that they started putting on heavy restrictions for firearms and weapons. 30 to 40 years later, in the entirety of that time, they have only had one mass shooting, and that is a perfect example as to why we should have limited magazines, thorough background checks, and have gun-free zones all over America, absolutely no guns, because it would prevent losses of lives.
That's enough. You guys are both nonsensical. Come back to reality. You guys are going to extremes here. Now, I understand you're both passionate about your opposite sides. You have very polar stances. However, we need to be logical here. Nobody is going to accept these kind of ideas, and so let's come to some middle ground where we can have some sort of agreement, okay? All right, Mr. Jenkins, let's begin. All right, I understand some of the points that Mr. Stouffer was making. However, I stand by my statement that it would be a violation of the Second Amendment to take away our guns. That's simply our intrinsic right as an American to have guns.
Well, I do agree with some of Mr. Sanchez's points, and I also disagree with a few of his other points. I would like to reiterate that the regulation of gun ownership and gun accessory is very important. I believe that we should limit the amount of ammunition inside of one magazine. Instead of having 30 rounds, I think we should take it down to 10 or 15. This would definitely save a lot more lives, much like in the San Diego Elementary School shooting situation. It would have prevented Lanza from using much more ammunition on these children and these innocent people just because he had the ability to. I also feel that regulation of gun ownership on assault weapons should be restricted. I do not believe that individuals should be able to own assault weapons altogether. I think that assault weapons should be reserved for our law enforcement and our military.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from with that. But at the same time, criminals will be criminals, and by taking away civilians' rights to having the guns that they may already own, that's leaving criminals with the opportunity to overpower civilians and potentially law enforcement as well. Whether it's new laws or old, criminals are not going to abide by them by their very nature. And I think that at least slightly negates a lot of the good that regulating guns would do.
I do agree with you, Mr. Sanchez, that criminals will be criminals, but I also believe that if we were to have more in-depth background checks, that this would prevent weapons from falling into criminals' hands, or it would prevent the wrong people from obtaining these weapons. If we do have more in-depth background checks, it would potentially stop a criminal from obtaining these guns in any legal manners because we do not have these more in-depth background checks. We are not checking for instabilities, or we are not checking for the possibilities that these people could be dangerous. I do believe that if we did have thorough background checks, criminals would be unable to obtain these guns legally and would only be able to obtain these guns through illegal manners, which would also help to prevent crime.
I see what you're saying. It could potentially cut down on the number of people that could legally have guns if they're mentally unstable or something along those lines. However, background checks aren't exactly completely effective. There are many instances where background checks might not be useful at all, such as coming back to Sandy Hook. Lanza killed his mom, who had legally attained the guns. Now, I'm sure if we had a mental evaluation on Lanza, it would show that he was mentally unfit to own a gun. However, he just killed someone. It didn't matter who it was. In this case, it was his own mother in order to gain access to such weapons. These assault weapons are already in circulation. They can't be taken out. And there are criminals that are going to get a hold of them one way or another. If someone's not going to kill their mom for them, I'm sure they would be just as willing to kill law enforcement who has access to them as well. Very good, very good. I appreciate you guys bringing it back to middle ground points where we can understand that. Now, do you have any instances, any examples where these points you brought up could be applicable? Yes, in fact, I do. As an Eastern High School student, I am a member of the Lansing School District. And so one instance that was close to home that had quite an impact on me was a attempted breaking and entering by some Everett students who are also members of the Lansing School District, which occurred on the 5th of November in 2015. Essentially, what happened was there was a group of about 8 Everett students, some of which were armed with weapons, with guns, illegally. These kids' ages ranged from 13 to 8. And they broke into houses. They were actually in the process of breaking into multiple homes. And they entered one home with the intention to steal and potentially to even harm some of the inhabitants of the home. We don't know that for sure. They were met with the homeowner, who was also a legal gun owner. And so this man defended his home by shooting some of the students. One went to the hospital and a couple others were minorly wounded. No one was killed, luckily. However, this is an instance where a civilian using a gun for self-protection, home protection, and protection of his family turned out to be positive, and there weren't any deaths. And it prevented his own death and possibly other people's as well. Very interesting to see a positive outcome from someone using a firearm. Mr. Stover, do you have an instance that you would like to put?
Yes, I also have an example, Mr. Jenkins. On the 6th of October in 2015 in Auburn Hills, Michigan, there was a man who was shoplifting from a Home Depot. Of course, he ran out into the parking lot and tried to quickly make it to his car. And one of the bystanders happened to have a concealed pistols license and also happened to have her concealed weapon on her person. She took it upon herself to try to defend herself or perhaps any other innocent bystander as well. Even though there was no danger, the shoplifter did not have any weapons, and so at this point the woman decided to fire a few shots at the man, and this created more danger, only for the fact that if one of those bullets had hit someone, it would have harmed someone rather than someone in the situation not being harmed, and ultimately that concealed weapon had created a more dangerous situation rather than helping the situation.
An interesting example as well. Well, gentlemen, that will be the end of our discussion today. I would like everyone to thank Mr. Patrick Stouffer and Luciano Sanchez for being our guests today. Please join us all next week for our next debate on politics. Yes.
I love your moderator.
Thank you. Now, to summarize what happened during this debate, I'm just going to walk you through it and point visually to what happened. We used a real-life situation here, and we looked at it from a couple different perspectives. We looked at it through emotion, and through memory, and through language. And these, you can see, we're at the top, we're in the real world, and the bottom, we're in the TOK world. Language is right on the border between the two, where we see that it can be interpreted different ways, and it essentially brings us into the TOK world, where we discuss our different sides. At first, they're very polar and extreme, but once they're moderated a little bit, they come to some middle ground arguments that can be argued logically. And then these are the ideas that we use to argue two more real-life situations that we thought express the two possible different types of outcomes that can occur when civilians can own guns.
I love the structure.
Yeah.
That was really nicely done.
This is pretty good.
The other comment I have